What would you do if the people you trusted most looked you in the eye, took your winter survival gear, and left you to die in a blinding blizzard? David Hinsley thought he was going on a historical expedition. Instead, he stumbled into a freezing nightmare and a multi-million-dollar secret buried in the ice. The Bitterroot Mountains on the border of Idaho and Montana are unforgiving, even on a beautiful summer day. But in late November of 2004, they were a death trap. David Hinsley, a 34-year-old land surveyor from Spokane, Washington, knew the risks. He was a seasoned outdoorsman who had mapped some of the most rugged terrain in the Pacific Northwest. That was exactly why Richard Stanton and Gregory Finch had recruited him. Rick was a smooth-talking amateur historian who claimed to have found a map belonging to a 1920s bootlegger. Gregory was the money behind the operation, a heavy-set, quiet man who owned a string of hardware stores in Boise. The three of them had spent months planning this trip. The goal was an uncharted ravine, where Rick believed a small fortune in Prohibition-era gold and cash had been stashed when a notorious smuggling ring was busted by federal agents. For the first 3 days, the camaraderie was high. They hiked deep into the backcountry, laughing, sharing stories around the camp stove, and following the faded lines of Rick's antique map. But the mountains have a way of punishing arrogance. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in less than an hour. A freak Arctic front had shifted south, and it was barreling right toward them. They were rushing to set up a secure base camp when the accident happened. David was carrying a heavy pack of climbing rope and rations across a steep scree slope, hidden beneath a fresh dusting of snow. His left boot slipped. He fell hard, tumbling down a 12-foot drop. When he landed, he heard a sickening pop echo over the howling wind. His knee was completely shattered. The pain was so immediate and intense that David blacked out for several seconds. When he came to, Rick and Gregory were standing over him. They dragged him up the slope and into the primary tent. As the blizzard hit with full force, burying the canvas in feet of snow, David lay agonizingly on his sleeping pad, shivering in shock. He couldn't put an ounce of weight on his leg. "We'll call for an airlift in the morning when the storm breaks," Rick had assured him, handing David 2 strong painkillers. "Just rest, Dave. We've got you." Lulled by the medication and the false comfort of his friend's promises, David fell into a deep, restless sleep. He woke up to absolute, terrifying silence. The wind had died down, but the inside of the tent was bitterly, unnervingly cold. David rubbed his eyes and called out for Rick. No answer. He called out for Gregory. Silence. Struggling through the blinding pain in his leg, David unzipped his sleeping bag and dragged himself toward the front flap of the tent. He pushed it open. The morning sun was blinding on the fresh snow, but the campsite was utterly empty. The second tent was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized David's chest. He frantically turned back into his own tent to check the gear. The satellite radio was gone. The camp stove was gone. The extra fuel canisters, the medical kit, and the flare gun, all gone. Even worse, David's insulated sub-zero sleeping bag liner had been stripped from his bag while he was heavily medicated. They had left him a single plastic bottle of water, which was already frozen solid, and 2 granola bars. There was no note. There was no explanation. Just a set of deep footprints leading back down the mountain, already half filled by the overnight snow. Rick and Gregory had done the math. Carrying a 200-pound man with a shattered knee out of the backcountry in 3 feet of fresh snow was impossible. Staying to wait for a rescue team meant risking their own lives in the freezing temperatures. So they made a choice. They took the survival gear, took the communication devices, and left David behind to become a tragic mountain statistic. They would simply hike out, go to the authorities, and claim David had vanished in the storm or fallen into a ravine where they couldn't reach him. They left him to freeze. And as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks that afternoon, plunging the valley back into sub-zero shadows, David realized with horrifying clarity that he had less than 12 hours to live. The human body does terrible things when it is freezing to death. Blood rushes away from the extremities to protect the vital organs. The fingers and toes burn as if they are on fire, before turning completely, deadeningly numb. David knew the stages of cold exposure intimately. He knew that if he stayed in that tent, he would fall asleep and never wake up. He had to move. Using his hunting knife, David cut up the remaining canvas of the tent and bound his shattered leg as tightly as he could, using a broken trekking pole as a crude splint. He wrapped his hands in his spare wool socks, tied his hood tight around his face, and began to drag himself out of the campsite. He couldn't walk, so he crawled, inch by agonizing inch. The pain in his knee was blinding, a sharp, ragged agony that flared with every movement, but the cold was a heavier, more oppressive enemy. By the third hour of dragging his body through the deep snow, David had lost all feeling in his feet. His eyelashes were frozen together. The moisture from his own breath had formed a layer of ice over his beard and lips. He was aiming for a lower elevation, hoping to find a cluster of dense pines that might block the wind, or a rock overhang where he could try to build a meager fire using the handful of matches in his pocket. But the terrain was relentless. As twilight began to set in, casting long, eerie blue shadows across the snow, David's mind began to play tricks on him. He started hearing voices in the wind, Rick laughing, Gregory counting money. He saw warm, golden lights flashing in the corners of his vision. He knew what this was. His brain was shutting down. The end was very close. He dragged himself to the edge of a snow-covered ridge and collapsed. He lay on his stomach, his cheek resting against the icy crust of the snow. It felt so soft. It felt so welcoming. A strange, dangerous warmth began to spread through his chest, the final, fatal stage of freezing, where the body's warning systems completely fail and the victim feels a sudden, overwhelming urge to strip off their clothes and sleep. David closed his eyes. He was ready to let go. But as his heavy eyelids fluttered, a sudden gust of wind blew a thick layer of snow off a mound just 30 yards below the ridge. David blinked. His frozen brain struggled to process the geometry of what he was seeing. It wasn't a rock formation. Nature doesn't make perfect right angles. It was a roof line. Adrenaline, primal and desperate, surged through his dying veins. With a feral groan, David dragged himself over the edge of the ridge. He slid and rolled down the embankment, crying out as his shattered knee banged against hidden rocks until he crashed in a heap at the bottom. He pushed himself up on trembling arms. Standing before him, half swallowed by the mountain, was a structure. It was an old cabin, built from massive, hand-hewn logs that had long ago faded to a dull, weathered grey. The roof was partially sunken, and the single window was boarded up from the inside, but the heavy oak door was intact. David crawled to the door and reached for the iron latch. His frozen hands were too clumsy. He beat against the handle with his forearms, weeping in frustration until the rusted metal finally gave way with a harsh shriek. He practically fell inside. The air inside the cabin was stale and smelled of dry rot, dust, and old pine, but it was out of the wind. To David, it felt like stepping into an oven. He dragged himself across the dirt and plank floor toward the corner where a small cast-iron wood stove sat rusting in the gloom. Miraculously, a small stack of dry, split wood sat next to the stove, untouched for decades. David's hands shook violently as he fumbled in his coat pocket for his waterproof match tin. He only had 5 matches left. The first one snapped in his clumsy, frozen fingers. The second one sparked, but he dropped it in the dust. Panic choked him. He focused every ounce of willpower he had left, striking the third match and holding it to a wad of dry moss he scraped from the cabin wall. The small flame caught. The moss crackled. Soon, the dry wood was blazing inside the iron stove. David collapsed in front of the fire, shaking uncontrollably as the excruciatingly painful process of thawing began. As the hours ticked by and the cabin slowly warmed, he finally had a moment to look around. The place was ancient. It looked like an old trapper's cabin, likely abandoned in the 1950s or 60s. There was a rusted metal bed frame in one corner, a decaying wooden table, and old tin cans scattered across a shelf. But as the ice on the floorboards began to melt from the heat of the stove, David noticed something strange. Right beneath where he was sitting, the wood looked different. The planks were scarred, but one specific board was perfectly smooth, and there were faint, almost imperceptible scrape marks around its edges, as if it had been pied up repeatedly. Driven by an instinct he couldn't explain, David reached out and tapped the board with the handle of his knife. It sounded hollow. He wedged the blade into the gap between the boards and pulled. With a loud crack, the ancient nails gave way, and the heavy plank popped loose. David stared into the dark cavity beneath the floor. Lying in the dust and cobwebs was a heavy, olive-green canvas duffel bag, wrapped tightly in thick chains and secured with a heavy brass padlock. He didn't know it yet, but the men who had left him to die were looking in the completely wrong valley. And this forgotten cabin was about to change his life forever. The heavy brass padlock on the canvas duffel bag was green with decades of oxidation, but it was still incredibly thick. David Hinsley sat back on the dusty floorboards, his breathing shallow, his shattered left knee throbbing with a sickening, rhythmic pulse. The heat from the cast-iron stove had brought feeling back to his extremities, and with that feeling came an agonizing, burning pain. But the sight of that chained bag pushed the agony into the background. He needed to open it. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a desperate, primal need to understand why he had been left to die. David dragged himself over to the wood stove and picked up a heavy iron poker that lay abandoned in the ash. He crawled back to the hole in the floor. With trembling, blistered hands, he raised the iron rod and brought it down on the padlock. Clang! The sound was deafening in the tiny, silent cabin. The lock didn't budge. David gritted his teeth, a low, feral growl escaping his cracked lips. He thought of Rick Stanton's easy smile. He thought of Gregory Finch's quiet, calculating eyes as they packed up the satellite radio. The betrayal burned hotter than the fire in the stove. He swung the iron poker again, and again, and again. He swung it until his knuckles bled, and his vision blurred with tears of sheer exertion and rage. On the 17th strike, the brittle, rusted internal pins of the padlock shattered. The heavy brass clasp popped open with a dry crunch. David threw the poker aside and tore at the thick chains, tossing them onto the wooden floor. He grasped the heavy zipper of the olive-green canvas bag. It was stiff, frozen with age and dust, but a hard yank pulled it open, revealing an inner lining of thick, waterproof oilcloth. He peeled the oilcloth back. David stopped breathing. The glow from the wood stove illuminated a small, breathtaking mountain of wealth. Tucked securely inside the bag were 6 heavy, wax-sealed glass mason jars. 3 of them were stuffed to the brim with tightly rolled, pristine paper currency, vintage $1,000 and $500 bills, the kind the federal government had stopped printing decades ago. But it was the other 3 jars that caught the firelight. They were filled with solid gold. Hundreds of perfectly preserved, uncirculated $20 St. Gordon's double eagle gold coins, gleaming as brightly as the day they were minted in the 1920s. Nestled right in the center of the jars was a small, leather-bound ledger. David reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the ledger free. The leather was brittle, flaking off onto his palms. He carefully opened the pages. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and written in faded fountain pen ink. Property of Arthur Donovan. November the 14th, 1928. Arthur Donovan. The name hit David like a physical blow. This was it. This was the legendary bootlegger whose smuggling ring had dominated the Pacific Northwest during Prohibition. This was the exact treasure Rick and Gregory had dragged him out here to find. But Rick's antique map had been fundamentally wrong. The amateur historian had convinced himself that Donovan had buried his illicit fortune in an uncharted ravine miles to the north, trying to hide it in the earth before the federal agents closed in. He hadn't. Donovan had simply brought it to his own secret, off-the-grid hunting cabin, stashing it beneath the floorboards where it had sat, untouched, for nearly 80 years. A manic, breathless laugh escaped David's chest. The sheer, unbelievable irony of it all washed over him. The men who had betrayed him, who had stolen his gear and left him to freeze, were currently risking their lives hiking toward an empty ravine. And they had unknowingly abandoned David right on top of a multi-million-dollar fortune. But the laughter died in his throat as a harsh gust of wind rattled the cabin's boarded-up window. He was rich. He was sitting on a historic fortune that belonged in a museum. But he was also crippled, starving, and trapped in a blizzard miles away from civilization. You can't eat gold. A $1,000 bill won't stop gangrene from setting into a shattered knee. If he wanted to live to see the look on Rick and Gregory's faces, he had to survive. David spent the next 2 days turning the cabin upside down. He found an old, rusted tin bucket, which he used to boil snow over the wood stove, keeping himself hydrated. His food consisted of the 2 squashed granola bars his betrayers had left him, which he rationed out in tiny, pathetic bites. In the back corner of the cabin, beneath a pile of rotting canvas, he made a discovery that would save his life. It was an old wooden trapper's toboggan, built for hauling heavy loads of pelts across deep snow. It was dusty, and the leather pull straps were stiff, but the wood was solid ash, preserved by the dry cold of the cabin. Next to it lay a pair of heavy, moth-eaten wool blankets. David went to work. He used his hunting knife to tear the wool blankets into thick strips, creating a heavily insulated, secure wrap for his shattered knee. He braced the leg with 2 sturdy pieces of wood he pried from the bed frame, binding it so tightly that the joint was completely immobilized. Then he prepared the treasure. He couldn't carry the heavy jars, and he couldn't leave them behind. He carefully transferred the gold coins and the bundles of cash directly into his own waterproof hiking pack, throwing the empty glass jars into the corner. He placed the leather ledger securely in his breast pocket, right over his heart. He strapped his heavily loaded backpack to the wooden toboggan, using the heavy chains from the duffel bag to tie it down securely. On the morning of his 5th day in the mountains, the wind finally stopped howling. The blizzard had broken. David pushed open the heavy oak door of the cabin and squinted against the blinding glare of the morning sun, reflecting off 3 feet of fresh, undisturbed powder. He tied the stiff leather straps of the toboggan around his waist and chest, creating a makeshift harness. He gripped 2 broken pieces of pine to use as crutches. He had a broken leg, no food, and 5 miles of rugged, snow-covered terrain between him and the nearest logging road. But as he looked back at the cabin, and then down at the fortune strapped to the sled behind him, a burning, relentless fear ignited in his soul. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was going to war. The journey down the mountain was a descent into pure, unadulterated hell. Without the use of his left leg, David couldn't walk. He had to propel himself forward, using his right leg and his crude wooden crutches, dragging the heavy wooden toboggan behind him. Every time the sled hit a hidden rock or a deep snowdrift, the harness violently jerked his torso, sending shockwaves of blinding pain down into his shattered knee. By noon of the first day, his hands were bleeding through his makeshift wool mittens. By sunset, he was hallucinating again, seeing shadows moving in the tree line. He spent that night huddled in the snow beneath the roots of a massive fallen cedar, wrapped in the remaining scraps of the cabin's wool blankets, shivering so violently he thought his teeth would crack. He kept himself awake by whispering the names of the men who had done this to him. Rick. Gregory. Rick. Gregory. He used his hatred as fuel. It was a dark, ugly thing, but it burned hot enough to keep the freezing temperatures from claiming his heart. On the afternoon of the second day of dragging the sled, the terrain finally began to level out. The dense, ancient pines gave way to younger trees, a sign of past logging activity. David's vision was narrowing to a dark tunnel. His right leg was cramping so severely, it felt like the muscles were tearing from the bone. He collapsed face first into a snowbank, the heavy toboggan sliding to a halt behind him. He couldn't push himself back up. His arms simply refused to obey his brain. He lay there, staring at the crystalline structure of the snowflakes inches from his eyes. He had made it so far. He had beaten the mountain. He had found the treasure. Was he really going to die just a few miles from the road? Then he heard it. It was faint at first, a high-pitched, mechanical whine cutting through the absolute silence of the wilderness. A 2-stroke engine. David's head snapped up. Adrenaline flooded his exhausted system, temporarily overriding the pain. He fumbled frantically with his frozen fingers, unzipping the top pouch of his backpack on the sled. He dug past the bundles of century-old currency and pulled out a small metallic object he had found in the cabin's dusty cupboard. It was an antique flare gun, heavy and rusted, with a single, massive red shell already loaded in the chamber. He hadn't known if it would still fire after 80 years, but he had brought it just in case. He pointed the heavy barrel straight up through a gap in the pine canopy. He closed his eyes, prayed to whatever was listening, and pulled the stiff trigger. The gun kicked like a mule, nearly breaking his wrist. A loud crack echoed through the valley, followed by a violent hiss. A brilliant, blinding sphere of red magnesium shot into the pale winter sky, burning fiercely as it drifted above the tree line. 10 minutes later, Deputy Carter Hayes of the Idaho Fish and Game Department rounded the bend on his heavy-duty snowmobile and slammed on the brakes. He stared in absolute disbelief at the emaciated, frost-bitten man lying in the snow, dragging a vintage wooden toboggan loaded with what looked like gold coins spilling from a modern hiking pack. "Holy Mother of God," Deputy Hayes breathed, rushing forward with his emergency medical kit. David looked up at the officer, his lips cracked and bleeding, a terrifying, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "I have a story to tell you," David whispered, his voice as rough as sandpaper. "And I need a phone." While David was fighting for his life in a hospital bed in Coeur d'Alene, being pumped full of broad-spectrum antibiotics and undergoing a grueling 6-hour reconstructive surgery on his knee, Rick Stanton and Gregory Finch were putting on the performance of a lifetime back in Spokane. They had hiked out of the mountains 4 days earlier, battered but alive, having found absolutely nothing in the ravine. They immediately went to the local authorities and reported a tragic accident. They claimed David had slipped on an icy ridge during the sudden blizzard and vanished into a deep crevasse. They spun a heartbreaking tale of how they had searched for him for hours in the blinding snow, risking their own lives, before finally accepting that their dear friend was gone. They even sat down for an interview with a local Spokane news station. Gregory looked solemnly at the camera while Rick, wiping away a fake tear, spoke about David's bravery and love for the outdoors. They were hailed as survivors of a terrible tragedy. 2 weeks later, the Spokane Police Department called Rick and Gregory down to the Central Precinct. The lead detective on the case told them that a fish and game patrol had recovered some items from the Bitterroot backcountry that might belong to their missing friend. The police needed them to identify the gear to help close the missing persons file. Rick and Gregory walked into the precinct with somber expressions, ready to play the grieving friends one last time. The detective led them down a fluorescent-lit hallway and pushed open the door to a large interview room. "We laid the recovered items out on the table," the detective said, his voice completely flat. "Tell me if you recognize anything." Rick and Gregory stepped into the room. There, sitting on the far side of the metal table, in a heavy-duty wheelchair, with his left leg encased in a massive metal and fiberglass halo brace, was David Hinsley. The color instantly drained from Rick's face. He stumbled backward, his jaw dropping open, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it looked like he had just seen a ghost. Gregory let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp, his knees buckling as he gripped the door frame for support. David didn't shout. He didn't scream. He simply leaned forward in his wheelchair, picked up the brittle, leather-bound ledger of Arthur Donovan from the table, and set it down with a soft thud. Beside the ledger sat 3 pristine, gleaming gold double eagles. "You guys were looking in the wrong valley," David said softly, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. Before Rick or Gregory could formulate a single word of excuse, 4 uniformed officers stepped into the room, handcuffs already drawn. The ensuing trial was a media sensation. Rick Stanton and Gregory Finch were charged with attempted murder, grand theft, and filing false police reports. Because David had survived, and because he had kept the torn pieces of his own tent and the exact inventory of the gear they had stolen, the prosecution's case was airtight. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before delivering guilty verdicts. Both men were sentenced to 25 years in a federal penitentiary, their lives ruined by their own greed and cowardice. As for the treasure, it sparked a massive legal battle. The state of Idaho, the federal government, and the IRS all tried to lay claim to Arthur Donovan's Prohibition-era fortune. But David had top-tier legal representation, funded by his incredible story. Because the cabin was located on an obscure tract of forgotten, unzoned land, and because Donovan had no living heirs, the courts ultimately ruled in favor of the finder's laws. After taxes and legal fees, David Hinsley walked away with just over $4 million. He never returned to land surveying. He bought a beautiful, sprawling ranch in Montana, far away from the treacherous peaks of the Bitterroots. He walks with a slight limp now, a permanent reminder of the mountain that tried to claim him. But every winter, when the first heavy blizzard rolls in and the temperature drops below zero, David sits by his massive stone fireplace, pours a glass of expensive bourbon, and looks at the single gold double eagle he kept mounted in a glass case on the mantel. It is a reminder that sometimes the universe has a very dark sense of humor. And sometimes the ultimate betrayal is just the universe's way of pointing you toward exactly where you were meant to be. What a truly unbelievable tale of betrayal, survival, and ultimate vengeance. David's nightmare in the freezing mountains proves that sometimes the worst human greed can lead to the greatest unexpected triumphs. If this incredible story of the bootlegger's hidden fortune had you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends who love true survival stories, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing historical dramas and real-life mysteries.